TNKR Media.
Welcome to Inspiring Entrepreneurs Montreal, showcasing stories from outstanding business people by FL Montreal. My name is Dan Delmar, along with, he's back, Michael Newton of FL. Mike, welcome back. It's been a while.
Hey Dan, how you doing?
I'm excellent. How are you?
Very good, thank you.
I want to apologize for our listeners because, we like to have our dynamic here, but you had a really busy fall. You were going all around the world. Where have you been?
I have been, let's see, I was in Australia for 4 days on business, 3 days of travel to 4 days on the ground. Everybody says, wow, Australia, what did you see? The inside of a boardroom, that what looked nice out my window, and that was pretty much it. So that the bucket list has not been crossed off for Australia based on that trip. I was in Nashville for a couple of days. I was in Lexington, Kentucky, which was a little more on the personal side, following up a couple of my horses that were running in the Breeders' Cup. So, I very much enjoy the travel, but it starts to take its toll. I'm not as young as I used to be, Dan.
Well, you look just fine, Mike. You seem vivacious today.
Yes, I look great on radio.
All right, let's dig into it. And first, let's deal with town halls for perhaps leaders of organizations who, might be absent once in a while. Maybe occasionally they want to call a town hall, reconnect with their workforces, and sometimes they can go awry. So recently, Google had one of these, and they got a lot of pushback from employees because employees, frankly, Mike, are more outspoken these days than they were before.
Yeah, they're definitely outspoken. We're also starting to hit that crossroads of post-COVIDian acceptance, and whether that is from the employer perspective or whether that's from the employee perspective. We're starting to see a recession on the horizon. You can argue with some people as to whether it's here or not, depending, I guess, where you sit in the conversation. But people have complained that productivity is down. There's a freeze on hiring. We're cutting costs. We're asking people to do more with the same or even less. So, yeah, we're starting to see pushback. I think, a lot of times during COVID, the town halls were used as kind of keep people up to date, what's going on. It was, used as a method of communication and transparency. I think now we're starting to see as people are looking into an economy that's starting to toughen, they're starting to see some cuts going on financially at their business. Ultimately, at the end of the day, the employees are starting to feel a little insecure or a little less boisterous, on how safe things are, and are now starting to worry. And as part of the worrying, one of the things we've learned through COVID is speak up and say what you have to say. So, if you this whole example coming from Google's town hall. It was an interesting line. He said, I remember when Google was small and scrappy, he said, we shouldn't always equate fun with money. I think you can walk into a hard-working startup and people may be having fun, and it shouldn't always equate to money. Well, that sounds to me like, the beginning of I'm going to give you stock options and I'm not going to pay you off the bat. The reality is we are seeing a shift, and coming out of COVID is certainly starting to, that whole post-COVID integration is begging, each of us to have this question is, where's this realism? Where's the perspective? Where's it going to lie, and where's it going to end? And I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shakeup coming on both sides of the equation.
So we have employees pushing back some cases, and depending on the boss, some bosses, if you're Elon Musk, maybe they're pushing back hard. But generally, I think the advice is you don't want to push back. You want to increase your empathy. And according to Inc.com here, you want to lead with heart. So they offer 4 words to entrepreneurs who to keep in mind as they're trying to lead with more empathy. 1 is hire people with heart. 2 is connect. 3 is empower them, and 4 is inspire them. So it's things that are very motivational, I think, is the trend here. So we're seeing CEOs maybe slip more into a coach mode.
Yeah, I think that's the objective. If you've been around a long time managing, it's awfully difficult to go from being non-empathetic to being empathetic overnight. What we're starting to see, there's a couple of things. I mean, this goes back to this was a classic leadership book called, Lead from the Heart. And it was kind of revolutionary and perceived as very fluffy. And, most of the cynical managers, amongst us said, don't be nice to workers. They got a job to do. You got to come down a little bit harder. You got to maintain ownership to what's going on. Interestingly enough, Mark Crowley just published a second edition of Lead from the Heart, and it's subtitled The Transformational Leadership for the 21st Century. And it once again brings this whole heart discussion into management, not saying it's anything other than there is something about soft. There is something about the soft component to managing people. And, they're now starting to create some very interesting breakthroughs and information that upends really the way we've traditionally been taught to manage, because there actually is some correlation between the brain and the heart and how we do things. And, he outlines the emerging science that shows how the human heart and brain are connected. And with the heart sending more signals to the brain than the brain actually sends back. So, you follow that logic, you say, well, boom, boom, boom. The brain is saying, it's logical. If you're going to fall into that thought process of leaving the heart out, you're certainly missing it. Now, a lot of people are going to turn around and say, yes, that's to serve the Gen Zs and the millennials and bring them up because they need instant gratification on the job that they're doing. Yeah. But you know what? That doesn't mean it's still wrong. It doesn't mean it's worth doing 95% of the time. But I think it's very interesting that we need to start, especially the older employers and the older managers, start recognizing that empathy and heart and understanding go a long way in getting motivation out of younger workers.
Yeah, positive reinforcement works. I mean, there's been many studies on this. Here's one that's kind of silly. This is from a company called Good Hire. They're an employment services company, and they tried to make the different types of bosses. So these are the types, Mike, and let me know if you fall into one of the types. There's the grinder boss, motivator boss, ghost, narcissist, want to be your BFF boss, accountable but caring boss, and of course, one sounds bad, the volcano boss. Probably you don't want to be one of those.
Yeah, no, look, it's a kind of it's a fun exercise to go through. And funny enough, I cut and paste the article and I sent it to all my partners and managers and said, where do you fall into this? And told them it was rhetorical. They didn't have to tell me what they thought. But, I dare say there's some days where we may find ourselves over the course of a week falling into many categories. You like to think at the end of the day you're a motivator and then you're pushing people forward. But I think it also depends on the industry that you're in, and I think it also depends on your upbringing. It's a very different generational discussion at this point.
And speaking of types of bosses, this other study that was published in Harvard Business Review zeroes in on the types of employee days. So what kind of day you're having at work. And they've studied this, and so they describe the typical workday as just that, typical. So about a third of workdays fall under typical. Just less than a third, about 29%, fall under ideal, where you're sort of getting maximum autonomy and also maximum efficiency. Crisis days, about 1 in 5 days, fall under that. Disengaged days, 10%, when you're kind of out of it. Maybe you're kind of lethargic, maybe you have some health issues going on. And then even less, 8%, so the smallest category of days, that's called toxic. So when you're going through conflicts or drama at the office.
Yeah, I really like to know where some people get their funding for some of these studies, because I got a good chuckle out of it again. How scientific it is. I'm not going to take it to the bank, but it is an interesting exercise when you consider trying to create motivation, but also trying to get people to understand that it's not always going to be warm and fuzzy. And unfortunately, many times we have a workforce that just wants it to go nice and smooth, and the reality is it's just not the way life is. And at the end of the day, when you take, crisis days, disengaged days, and toxic days, which, to me are pretty much on the negative side of things, you're talking over, almost 40% of your days based on this study. So, 2 days a week. I think some of us can empathize with that statement. I'm sure some of us would like it only to be 2 days a week. But there is no doubt that the type of work day and how that affects your performance is right there. I mean, you look at the crisis day, and that's probably that's 1 day a week, and I don't think that that's an unreasonable statement. Is you walk in, all you do is put out fires. You start with a list in the morning. You never get to what you wanted to do. You leave at the end of the day. You look at yourself in the mirror and go, "What did I do today? what did I do today? All it did is I felt like I was running around putting out fires. So, yeah, I think it's a little bit of an interesting conversation from a realism perspective, and I think in the post pandemic world that we're living in, the consequences of the last two categories, the disengaged and the toxic, or the negative and toxic days, are more frequent and potentially more harmful to productivity, employee retention culture, and underlying DNA of an organization. So, while this may be a little bit of fun in an event, there is definitely, as an owner and as a manager, how do you try and reduce those negative categories? Because that's going to have a really long-term effect on your culture and your hiring. I mean, nobody wants to walk in and work for a job where 80% of the days are toxic.
Let me ask you real quick, how do you diffuse a toxic situation at work as a boss? Do you send someone home? Do you take a timeout, a private area?
Really, I love that question because it feeds right into a conversation I had the other day with millennials and how they were brought up. And, the sense of accountability was, you're going to go to your room and have a timeout. I'm really not interested in trying to do that from a business perspective at the end of the day. I think realism, I think keeping your cool as a manager, I think that ability to be very direct and honest, but maintain control. All of those things we learn in emotional intelligence really come into play. And self-regulation, I think, when you're dealing with a crisis, is massive in all of this. Is really, don't let it get the better of you. And I don't like to be beaten. I'm very competitive, so I don't like when an environment has finally gotten through to me. I wouldn't lie. There's a few times where I may blow up on purpose, but that's more worthy of an Academy Award than it really is a lack of self-awareness at the end of the day.
And just remember, your ideal workday is 2 to 3 days away. So just hang in there.
My ideal, I don't even know where to go with that concept. I mean, we're going to start working half days. We're going to have 3 people working 2 days. Let's not go there. And you're talking at it from a statistical standpoint. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a whole bunch of things that are going to start in the next couple of years to kind of work its way through in terms of what the eventual workday is. If you think what we're dealing now is what the future is, there's still a lot of changes to come, folks.
All right, we're going to talk about a really innovative product coming up next. Mike, talking about productivity, I mean, this will increase productivity. It's a stop smoking aid. That's also an app and a sort of an AI-powered vaporizer. And it's really trying to optimize the process of quitting smoking. Laurent Laferrière is co-founder of the startup Ditch Labs. Laurent, welcome to CJD.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for being here. So you're on a mission to help people quit smoking, and you're doing it with some tech. Tell me about Ditch Labs.
Yeah, so Ditch Labs is a medical technology in the addiction space. So we're solving the leading cause of preventable death, which is smoking. So we've developed a medical nicotine vaporizer that's able to precisely dose the amount of nicotine delivered, and that reduces the doses automatically through a prescribed treatment. And the device is paired to an app that kind of acts as a psychological self-help program to help with the cravings, what triggers, obviously the triggers to want to smoke. And so we're the first solution that actually addresses the physiological addiction to nicotine through what we call nicotine replacement therapy, and the psychological aspect of nicotine as well, nicotine addiction as well, through our mobile app.
So I grew up, unfortunately, a secondhand smoker. I've really never smoked in my life, but I've certainly lived the secondhand side of things. I can see the effects, what smoking itself does on family members. Maybe just walk us through a little bit obviously there's a massive cost to society with regard to smoker-related illnesses, and maybe some of the social sides to it as well.
Yeah. So unfortunately, smoking is the leading cause of preventable death. Just in Canada, it's about 50,000 deaths per year. In the US, it's 10 times that, so 500,000 a year. The economic burden is huge. In Canada, it's about $17 billion a year that's spent on treating smoking-related illness. Cigarette smoke causes pretty much every cancer out there. I think it's responsible for 13 different kinds of cancers. So it affects every organ in the body. So very, very detrimental, obviously, to the health and to the economy as well. So I think for us, it's exactly what motivates us. It's the scale of the problem and the scope of the problem. And to give you kind of idea globally, it's 1.3 billion people who smoke. So, in Canada, it's only 15% of the population. So we were kind of successful getting those numbers down from about 50% to 15% now. But it's still a very, very important problem in other parts of the world as well. So we're excited about the the scale that our solution can have in the world as well.
So maybe walk us through the solution. I mean, we talked very briefly in the intro in terms of what it is and then the AI component to it and everything else. But dumb it down for us. I mean, what is this? Is this a vape? Is this, how does it work?
Yeah, good question. So I'll kind of backtrack a bit. Smokers are very desperate to quit smoking. It's about 68% of smokers who want to quit, but it's only 7% who succeed. So there's a clear unmet need here. And being desperate, I think smokers are looking for better solutions. So the products that usually they're used to quit smoking, like nicotine replacement therapy, so the patch, the gums. There's also pharmacotherapies like Champix, for example, or Zyban or Wellbutrin. So all those solutions have very low success rates, anywhere from 5 to 20%. So what actually happened, since 5-6 years ago is we've seen the rise of electronic cigarettes. And those devices are now the most popular tool to quit smoking. So it's more popular than, any patch gums, any pharmacotherapy, because they mimic the experience and they deliver nicotine very, very efficiently. So it's very similar to smoking a traditional cigarette, with obviously less consequences on health. However, those devices bring other problems. We've seen underage use of those devices. We've seen recently in the US Juul being banned for that specific reason. The toxicological profile as well of those devices is unknown. Maybe it's known from the tobacco industry, but the scientific literature, it's rather unknown. So we decided, well, let's take this popularity and let's take this device and actually try to reinvent it and bring it into the medical world, which is, in our opinion, the way it should have been marketed at first. So what we created is a nicotine vaporizer. It resembles an electronic cigarette, but like I mentioned before, it's able to very precisely dose the amount of nicotine delivered, and it reduces the doses automatically to wean the user off nicotine. So we have if I'm trying to dumb it down as much as I can, we have two different liquids inside our vaporizer, one containing nicotine, but one we call the placebo liquid. And by varying one liquid or the other, we're able to vary the doses very precisely. And that's what allows us to do the gradual nicotine reduction and the titration. But what's also amazing is that this device is able to gather and collect a lot of data on the consumption, whether it is the time of day the nicotine is consumed, obviously the quantity, but we have very granular data about even the depth of inhalation that comes out of the device. So we know when the user is inhaling more deeply on the device, which could potentially mean that there's a craving happening, and we can address that inside the mobile application with a breathing exercise or a meditation exercise. So that's why I mentioned it's really the first solution that addresses both physiological and psychological components of the addiction.
It's very interesting. I want to dig into the data in a few minutes, but first, just on vaping in general. Going back 10 years, I remember some vapers were telling me that they used vaping to quit smoking, and they were swearing by it. And I was like, well, I don't know. I mean, shouldn't you do this in a medical context? Is that what you're doing here? Are you trying
Exactly, yeah. Our system is, so it's not commercialized yet. We're a medical technology company, so we've only been working on that specific project for almost 3 years now, which is, it seems like a long time, but in the medical technology field, it's rather short. So we have a whole bunch of validation to do to prove to Health Canada and the FDA that we're safe and effective to treat a nicotine addiction. But yes, what we're seeing with electronic cigarettes actually is that smokers who use them to quit smoking actually just end up staying addicted to nicotine through the electronic cigarette. So it's a great alternative to traditional cigarettes, but it's not a nicotine addiction treatment like ours.
So I guess if you can't wean yourself off 100%, the scaling back to the quantities in and of itself is a significant reduction in nicotine and a significant effect on, or positive effect on, the body. So I may not be able to wipe it out completely, but I certainly should be able to bring it down to a dramatic amount. Is there a significant health effect just to the massive amount of reduction, even if I get it down to a minimal level?
For sure. At Ditch, we try to prone as much as we can harm reduction, because we've had such a binary view of addiction, whereas you succeed or you fail to quit smoking, right? There's nothing in between. But having someone reduce his or her cigarette consumption from 25 cigarettes a day to 5 cigarettes a day is a huge accomplishment that we should celebrate, right? So we're trying to kind of have this view of addiction where we allow people to reduce. And yes, there's huge health benefits related to that. That's for sure.
I mean, there's no doubt also, you look at all of this and you say that, there's a social component to smoking, and there certainly is a push from the medical profession, as well as many proponents of cutting down on smoking, that the social and the dollar costs associated with smoking should maybe not be borne by society. Should it be borne by an individual, right? At the end of the day. So if you've chosen to smoke all your life and you end up in the hospital and there's a big cost associated with it, I mean, I'm not saying we're going to get to that position, but it's certainly been a topic of conversation. Where does that fit into this whole exercise? I mean,
Yeah, so
it's kind of the ethical conversation, I guess.
Exactly. And I'm trying to weigh my words here, but in our opinion, and the World Health Organization clearly said that nicotine addiction is a chronic disease. So we have to view it as with the disease lens, not it's the smoker's fault. Someone who's addicted to nicotine, it's extremely difficult for some people to quit. And as a society, I think we've tried pretty much everything right now. Like we've increased the prices on tobacco products. We've essentially banned any marketing efforts. Obviously, the branding on any tobacco product is not existent anymore. So we've done, as a society, I think, the necessary work to bring those numbers down. But what we're seeing right now is that we're left with about 15% of the population that's still addicted to nicotine, and the economic burden is still huge. So we need to find new ways. And experts agree that, kind of the next frontier is to be able to develop treatments that are 100% personalized based on the multifactorial aspect of the addiction. And that's exactly where we fit in at Ditch.
We're going to get to some of those factors in a few minutes, talking about data, what kinds of data points you're collecting, and what kind of tools, all kinds of tools you're going to include in your app to help people to quit smoking. But let's talk about tech. And so, Laurent, tell me about some of the data that you collect, or the data points. What are some of the different AI tools you're using to help people quit in a well-rounded way?
Yeah, so our plan is to collect a bunch of data points, namely related to the consumption of nicotine. So anything related to the quantity of nicotine consumed, if the time of day as well, when the nicotine is consumed, the time between each inhalation as well, because we see there's a lot of behavioral components related to the time between the inhalations. If someone is taking 10 different inhalations in a very short period of time versus someone who's taking 10 inhalations within an hour, it's a very different behavior. So we're analyzing that and collecting the data based on that. We also, for example, the time of day is very important, because if someone wakes up during the night to consume nicotine, we know that it's a much more severe addiction versus someone who doesn't wake up during the night to consume nicotine. So these are all, consumption data points that are very interesting. And we have also like a whole bunch of sensors in our device. One that I'm particularly proud of that we have a patent on is a pressure sensor that's able to track the depth of inhalation, like I mentioned before. So we're able to detect cravings when someone is inhaling more deeply on the device. So again, we're trying to kind of bridge the gap between having the consumption data it's very important, right? When you go to the pharmacy to quit smoking, they ask you how many cigarettes you smoke per day. And that's, the consumption aspect of it. Obviously, we know the nicotine that's consumed, but we want to push it even further and get behavior data. So with the inhalation sensor, for example, and what that allows us to do is we obviously plug in an AI. So it's reinforcement learning that is able to essentially assess the patient and personalize the treatment. So for example, someone who wakes up during the night, if the AI understands that pushing an article based on what should I do when I wake up during the night and have a nicotine craving, and that works for that specific person, can we find another patient that's similar and push an article as well, because we know it's going to increase success rates in the end. So we can train an algorithm to be able to kind of personalize the whole experience, obviously keeping in mind that we want to have a higher success rate at the end of the day.
It's very interesting that listening to you talk, there's, I can see the societal effect. I can see the medical effect. I mean, how do we take this beyond a societal, smoking versus non-smoking, trying to cut down and actually turn what you're trying to do and you're doing and you're accomplishing, and how do we get that into a medical formula? How do we cross that barrier from, hey, buy my product because, it's going to help you stop smoking, to an actual treatment?
Yeah, so we're an actual treatment. We're prescribed by a physician. So that's a choice we made very early on in the business. Is we know that there can be some sort of association with electronic cigarettes, and every electronic cigarette is backed by a tobacco company. So we wanted to make sure to stay away from that as much as possible. And one great path was to be prescription only. So our whole treatment is followed by a physician, which is brings it into the medical world. But we can go even further. Like what we're developing right now is we're essentially gaining an understanding of addiction and a broad understanding of addiction, not just nicotine addiction, because many addictions, any substance addictions, are very similar. So we're able to better understand exactly what the triggers are, how to beat cravings, and this can be translated into other types of addiction, like opioid addiction, for example. And the other part is that we're developing a proprietary drug delivery mechanism that can also be used for other substances. Like we saw, again, with the opioid crisis, is, doctors were prescribing pills, and those pills can be abused very easily. So when you think of prescribing a substance that in its essence is addictive, you need some sort of mechanism to make sure that the user is not going to abuse it, right? So that's exactly what we've built in our ditch pen, which is our vaporizer. So it can be translated to other addictions as well.
Yeah, our societal changes associated with addiction are slowly starting to phase in. I mean, they lock everybody up and throw away the key mentality of the war on drugs that found its way into the 80s and 90s, is hopefully slowly starting to be replaced by some logical treatment of drug addiction as a medical crisis, and not as a choice at the end of the day. I mean, you can see the same thing with alcohol. I would only assume that the changes that we're starting to see, the more we can put medical science behind the curbing component of this, the more we bring to the forefront the reality of that addiction is a problem and it's not a choice.
Oh, of course, and we're seeing it. Just because the pandemic created a substantial increase in the consumption of drugs or alcohol. We're seeing it with the opioid crisis. It affects families, regular families. Maybe in the 80s and 90s, I wasn't around. I'm born in 1990, but maybe.
Thanks for sharing that and making me feel old.
Maybe it was more what you would typically imagine as someone using drugs. Right now, it's the regular person that just had an accident, had to manage their pain, and was prescribed opioids to manage their pain, and they got addicted to it. So I think our view is slowly changing, but it for sure needs to change much quicker.
So you're still at the early stage, you're still at the clinical. How do you mainstream this? How do you get this to market in a much larger process? And what are the steps you have to go through in order to get this approved, in order to move forward?
Yeah, it's a very long process, but I've learned to kind of embrace that process, because on a business side, it brings new entrant defensibility. What we're building right now and what we're validating and all the studies that we're doing, they're obviously necessary to get a marketing authorization from Health Canada and the FDA. And anyone else who wants to copy us will have to do the same thing. So in that regard, I've learned to embrace it. But it's a very long process. We have 3 phases of clinical trials to do. Unfortunately, we'll have to do animal studies as well to validate the toxicity of our device. And I say unfortunately because it's somewhat unethical, I guess, to use animals, but it's a requirement from Health Canada and the FDA that we've tried to circumvent, but it's not possible. So we'll have to do that. And then, this whole process will take another 2.5 years to 3 years, and then we'll get to actually market our product.
Find it very interesting that, you look at vape and you look at how easy they came onto the market and how there was zero control, and you guys are doing something good with positive, a positive process, and you're being, highly regulated. Is that because you chose to go the medical route initially with it? If you had just chose to throw this onto the market, would it have made a difference?
You're absolutely right. I mean, I look back in 2019, and when we made the choice to become, a fully medical product, we were kind of at a crossroads where we could have commercialized it as a vape, in every convenience store, but we didn't believe this was the right way to do it. And I would lie if I was saying it wasn't a struggle in the last 3 years to kind of wait for the moment where electronic cigarettes became heavily regulated. And now we're seeing actually that we've made the right choice because those companies are slowly falling. So I guess it's starting to pay off. But it was a long 3 years wait.
Well, you got to hope at the end of the day that principle and the goals and the objectives that you guys have and the values are actually what play out in the long term. And I do believe ultimately at the end of the day that comes back to do you well. So power to you to take the high road. We just hope it doesn't take too much longer to get you there.
No, but we'll get through it, even if it's long. We'll get through it.
And Mike, usually we do dig into the story. We've been so fascinated with the product, but real quick, Laurent, where'd the idea come from? How'd you start?
Yeah, it's came from a personal problem. I was addicted to vaping, so went to the pharmacy. Like it's kind of a funny story. Initially, went to the pharmacy and looked at nicotine replacement therapies, so any Nicorette product, and everywhere on the packaging was saying if you smoke 25 cigarettes or more per day, take this dosage. If you smoke 25 cigarettes per day or less, take that. And I was like, wow, if I'm not alone who's addicted to vaping, what are my options to quit vaping if every product is really targeted towards smokers? That was the initial spark. But then you're starting reading scientific literature and realizing that actually smokers are massively using electronic cigarettes to quit. So what was kind of my problem was the hope of a smoker somewhere. But then again, researched the products and said, "Well, okay, there's a lot of problems with electronic cigarettes that we need to fix." And the product evolved from an idea to help people quit vaping to essentially helping the 1.3 billion people worldwide quit smoking.
Amazing. Laurent Laferrière, co-founder of the startup Ditch Labs. Laurent, hang on, please. We'll have your one piece of advice for inspiring entrepreneurs coming up in a few minutes. And coming up next, Julie Côté, senior manager at FL. She's going to take a look at Canada-wide rules about property acquisitions, especially if you're from out of the country. Now, a lot of entrepreneurs, Mike, are from out of town. There are some new rules about people who are buying property and paying taxes on the property here in Montreal that people should be aware of. Across Canada, actually. Julie Côté, senior manager at FL Fuller Landau, here to go through some of those. Welcome back, Julie.
Thank you for having me.
Mike, the foreign ownership thing was very hot in the news, but those rules are coming in.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think there's a lot of confusion and associated with all of this. So, Julie, I think part of the job today is to debunk some of the issues that are out there. So, what's the new tax measure that everybody's talking about on non-resident property ownership?
So, actually, in the 2022 federal budget, they announced a multitude of housing measures to help Canadians, among which was this 2-year ban on foreign purchases. So foreigners purchasing property in Canada, certain types of residential property. So the bill C-19 got royal assent in June, which means it's a go. It's official. The ban is for 2023 and 2024, starting this January, and it will be renewable after December 31st, 2024. If needed. So they're going to decide on that later. This measure, along with the other one that was issued in 2022 about underused property owned by non-residents, is part of a lot of other measures. And it's meant to further discourage foreign speculation in Canada with regards to the housing market and to provide housing for Canadians, whether they're buyers or renters, tenants.
they're basically looking to take a little bit of the heat off of the market, replace homeowners by locals, and it's to a little bit of a degree, I guess, it's playing God with the housing market, and there's understandable because the pressure has been out there for them. But this really does have a limited time frame, right? This is the bill as it was put forth is ending in the end of 2024.
Yes. However, they included a clause that it could be renewed for another 2 years.
So who the biggest effect on all of this obviously is foreign property owners. So where's the distinction in terms of foreign property owner versus somebody who's actually using it themselves? If they're coming to Canada if they want to go to Whistler or they want to go to Tremblant, what does that look like?
Okay. Let's backtrack and start with who will still be allowed to buy Canadian properties. So that's anyone who is a Canadian citizen living abroad, a permanent resident living abroad or here, or any people living in Canada under a work or a student permit, still valid. However, they made an exception for foreigners buying with their Canadian spouse. So if I'm buying with my husband, he's a Canadian, I'm not, we can co-own a property together. So I can piggyback on him for that. That's the only exception for non-residents. This ban will also apply to foreign corporations and trusts, and also on foreign-controlled Canadian corporations. So if I have a Canada Inc., but it's controlled by a foreigner, the ban will apply to this purchase. However, again, if someone signed a promise to purchase before December 31st, 2022, this transaction will go through, it will be honored, and these people will be able to close, let's say in January, February 2023. Let's think about people who are buying brand new properties on plan that they signed 2 years ago and they're getting delivery in 2023 or 2024. So they made a clause in the ban that these people, and even anyone, they have to make it broad, anyone who signs a promise to purchase before December 31st will be able to close on their property.
So we've gone through who locally can buy. So what type of properties can foreigners still buy?
So the ban covers single dwellings, semi-detached home, townhouses, and duplexes. So anything bigger than that, threeplex and up, foreigners will still be allowed to buy. And that will also include commercial properties, which brings me to all these vacation recreational properties. If they are commercial, they will be allowed to be purchased by foreigners. There's also a gray area right now, and they're talking about allowing foreigners to still purchase properties outside of urban areas, let's say Mont-Tremblant, but not for rental and not for commercial purposes. But we don't have any information on that. It's one line in the documents. It's nothing. I guess we will see as 2023 rolls over.
Julie Côté, Senior Manager at FL Fuller Landau. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan.
And as we come to the end of our show, let's turn to our entrepreneur, Laurent Laferrière of Ditch Labs, and ask him for his one piece of advice for inspiring entrepreneurs. Laurent, what do you think?
I think the advice that personally changed a lot in my entrepreneurial journey is someone who told me be passionate about the problem, not the solution. Because as a younger entrepreneur, so maybe 10 years ago, was very creative. I had a bunch of ideas, but it's not really the way to launch a successful business. Thinking about ideas, you need to open your antennas and look around you and find a very significant problem. So successful entrepreneurs are able to create what society needs, but doesn't know how to get at scale. And I think this all starts with a very, very clear problem. And even though your first solution, might be a good idea, if you're so passionate about the problem, you're going to be able to pivot and find other solutions. And at the end of the day, you'll have the best, solution out there to solve that problem that you're looking to solve.
Thanks, Laurent. Mike, optimizing the process of quitting smoking has got to be one of the best ideas we've discussed on the show.
Yeah, it's interesting just because Laurent's description of that one thing, being passionate, you recognize that it is about the journey at the end of the day. The entrepreneurial side, as it is the journey to quitting smoking, it is a process. It is getting there. And if you go back to the binary, pass fail, you never go on to your next alternative. And from an entrepreneurial side, so I think there's a lot of similarities between what you're preaching and what you're living. So congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Laurent Laferrière of Ditch Labs. Thanks so much, Laurent. And a reminder, you can subscribe to Inspiring Entrepreneurs Montreal as a podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, or wherever you find your podcast. Next week, Mike, Lily Fortin, the second generation CEO of the Canadian fashion retailing giant Tristan. We'll see you then.
This has been a production of TNKR Media. Good talk.